humans do not really store carbohydrates as body fat. Hey everybody, I thought I would chat with you guys and gals a little bit about this today. And it almost shouldn't be a topic that we even have to discuss anymore, but apparently it is because of so many fad diets. And I want to make some points clear. When I say that humans don't store carbohydrates as body fat, that is not a conflict at all with the idea that low carb diets can be useful for fat loss. So we need to understand the distinction, because at the end of the day, what do a lot of low carb diets do? Well, a lot of people on those sort of diets, they have suppressed appetite. They don't get as hungry. And if you eat less calories, guess what happens? You lose weight. Okay? It's very, very straightforward. In fact, you lose body fat, right? Calorie deficit creates a loss of body fat always, every single time. Okay? Always. So if that sort of diet helps you reach a calorie deficit, then of course, because again, as long as you're burning more than you eat, you're going to burn stores in your body. It's pretty straightforward. But when we come to the idea of actually gaining body fat, we need to be clear here that humans do not store carbohydrates as body fat to an appreciable degree. Now, does that mean that you can't gain body fat on a diet that is high in carbs and low in fat? No, it's absolutely possible to gain fat, because again, you're still eating fat, and we require some fat in our diet for basic health, although I will point out the types of fat, polyunsaturated fats that are essential, that we have to have for survival, do not store quite as easily as body fat. Not quite as efficiently as, say, more saturated fats, and then to a lesser degree monounsaturated fats. But we need to be clear, when you look at the data on it, both looking at what carbohydrates do as well as storage of different things in the body, it's very clear that pretty much all the fat on our body came from dietary fat. And I'm going to approach this from two different directions. First of all, this has been studied quite a bit in modern years, looking at things like carbon isotope testing that measure what goes in, what you're eating, and then to see kind of where it goes in the body. And what we find is that all the fat under your skin, right, your subcutaneous fat, 100% of it comes from fat you eat. None of it comes from carbohydrates or protein. None of it. Now, when people say, but what about studies showing that sometimes Denovo lipogenesis goes up, which is the storage, the creation of new fat, right, from, say, carbohydrates, right? Because protein does not have a direct route. It can hypothetically be converted to carbs and then hypothetically turn into body fat, but it's never actually been demonstrated to happen in the lab. Okay, we've never actually been able to get a human to do it, but it is in theory possible, because you just simply cannot create enough carbohydrate from protein to get de novo lipogenesis. Okay, it just doesn't happen. But when you look at it, that's what happens. But what about the de novo lipogenesis? But that's only happening in organs. So when we come over to visceral fat, yes, it is absolutely possible to gain visceral fat, which is not under the skin, it's around the organs. In other words, you have muscle covering all of it. There's muscle between that, your abdominal wall and everything else. All the muscles of your trunk will be covering it, so you won't be able to actually touch it or pinch it or anything else. So it's not the fat that you can see. However, even then, it's not going to be large quantities. And this is where the case can be made against things like refined sugars in terms of fat gain. Sure, they can contribute more to organ fat, absolutely. But starchy carbs don't really have much of a case for that even there. So what we find when we look at it as, because some de novo lipogenesis happens, is that around 99% of the total fat in your body comes from fat that you ate. Around 1% can come from, carbohydrates and in theory protein, but again, that's only a hypothetical pathway. It's never actually been found to occur. But again, all of that fat is it's only going to be around the organs. And keeping in mind, saturated fat actually stores as liver fat and organ fat more easily than fructose does. Now, fructose will store more easily around your organs than, say, monounsaturated or polyunsaturated fats. Now, that has actually been confirmed in the lab. But again, we're only talking about fructose that reaches the bloodstream. which again, we're only getting to an appreciable degree from refined sugars. So refined sugars are a little bit different of an animal when we have this discussion, but we all know that, we understand that. And when we say carbohydrates in general, we really aren't telling anyone, hey, you should eat a bunch of table sugar or high fructose corn syrup. That's not the case anyone is making. But keeping in mind, rice and potatoes are not going to create this effect. Neither is pasta or bread either. So you have that. Then we look at studies on Denovo lipogenesis, and what we've largely found is that it happens in other animals at a higher rate than humans. The whole myth of humans storing carbohydrates as body fat came from rodent models, rodent studies done 20 plus years ago. And then they started studying, and it created myths that even a lot of researchers and experts looked at. Well, yeah, it happens in Denovo lipogenesis. But then when they studied it later in humans, it was found to not really occur. It occurred at a much smaller rate than we thought that we could, because again, rodents do it at 10 to 20 times the rate that humans do. And then we found that it was limited to visceral fat around organs, not fat under your skin. And we see the same thing in the epidemiology. If anyone who doesn't understand this, they're like, well, this is just all in the lab. What about in the real world? Well, the cultures around the world that have the lowest fat tend to have the lowest body fat, right? High carbohydrate diets in many cultures around the world are associated with being lean. Some of the leanest living, longest living cultures on earth with the lowest rate of heart disease, lowest rates of diabetes, eat diets that are higher on average in carbohydrates than cultures that are on the other extreme, that have more obesity, more heart disease, more diabetes, like America. Right? Perfect example would be like the Okinawans and Japanese diets. Okay, leaner people, yet their percentage of their diet coming from carbohydrates is higher. So we see that in the epidemiology as well. So we see that all the time. And whenever someone says, well, I get really fat from eating a lot of carbs, and you start looking at their diet, they're eating a high-fat diet every time. Yeah, they're eating a bunch of refined carbs, usually. But then you look at their diet and they're eating high-fat foods. So most of the foods that people are thinking of that is making them fat, they're high-fat foods. Cake, pizza, ice cream, French fries, so on and so forth. These are high-fat foods. They're high-fat foods. All of these foods are 40% or more of their calories come from fat. That's extremely high fat. Then you combine that with refined carbohydrates. Well, yeah, that's a recipe for disaster, because your body's going to want to burn the carbohydrates and just store the fat. Okay? Because that's how it works. It wants to burn carbs, not store them, but you're going to give it plenty of fat that it can store, and of course it's going to do it. All right, guys, well, that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.